Hey guys, how we doing? You got Cam from Awakenpedia. Welcome back. Today we have another video teaching on the topic of suffering, and specifically on the value of suffering and the role it plays in the awakening journey and helping us to transform out of our minds and into the heart. So, um, suffering is one of my favorite topics. I think it is fascinating in how, like all aspects of truth, how paradoxical it is, and that um, in its essence, it serves as the foundational transformational fuel to progress us on the awakening journey and to make us more conscious. So, I think what's best here to begin, and just to remind you guys, all of this is unscripted, right? So these videos, when I create them, they come from the unknown through the unknown. Um, there's no predetermined script or anything that I want to say in particular about it. I try not to think about discussing the topic beforehand. I really want it to be authentic and raw and channeled from the higher self through my form and then shared with you guys. So, because of that, bear with me and appreciate the natural flow of this conversation for all of its awkward tendencies, which are inclusive of pauses and me losing my train of thought and whatever else happens, okay? So, let's dive into it. But suffering. The title of this teaching is The Value of Suffering. I'd like to begin by first talking about what suffering actually is, providing a sense of explanation of the concept um, as viewed from a place of purity and truth, and not, of course, from a worldly sense or conventional sense of suffering. And then we'll dive into its value on the awakening journey, the role it plays, how we can use it to serve us in our journey, as opposed to something that keeps us anchored down and stuck in victim mode. So, suffering, what is it? Oftentimes, people confuse suffering as something that is only that which is very intensely tragic, the stereotypical picture of somebody who is bent over in agony, hysterically crying through some type of tremendous loss they've experienced or some type of significant life event that's going on. And while, of course, that is true, that is certainly a form of suffering, it's not the only one. It's just suffering with a specific vibration, suffering to a certain degree. Suffering is also the slightest, smallest irritation that you experience, as when somebody cuts you off in traffic and you get upset with them, so you flip them off, you curse under your breath, you feel the anger rising up within you, that sense of disturbance as to resist what is happening in the now. That too is suffering. Just as much as suffering when you are in such deep agony and despair that you're considering suicide, you can't take it any longer. That too is suffering. Again, just differences in degree, differences in intensity. But suffering in and of itself is most simply resistance to the now that often manifests itself as some form of stress, some type of negative emotional reaction to whatever is happening in the moment. And so, suffering is the resistance to the now. That's the most simple, pure way to look at what suffering is. How large that resistance is to the now, that changes, right? That's what ebbs and flows. That's what varies from situation to situation, person to person, based on their karmic cycle, where they stand in the awakening journey. That is what determines the intensity of the suffering one person experiences versus another. Because what's different is the interpretation of the event itself, which of course is a function of consciousness. So that's suffering, right? And when you look at suffering from that view, you realize that people are suffering all around the world, all day, every day. Most people are living in a state of resistance to the now, wishing that they had something else, were doing something else, that something was different from how it is. And that's another really simple but true way to understand the concept of suffering, which is suffering is nothing more than the gap between how things should be versus how things are. How things should be versus how things are. The gap is suffering. When the gap is removed, meaning no longer is there a mental position on how things should be so that the gap is gone and now things just as they are, suffering is gone too. And we'll talk about today how we get there, how we can get to a point of suffering being dissolved so that you can live in alignment and acceptance of how things are, as opposed to wishing or imposing a mental position on how things should be. So, what is the value of suffering in this sense? How can suffering be valuable? Why is it valuable? And what is the role it plays in the awakening journey? And this is where suffering becomes so fascinating because it works in such interesting paradoxical ways. But suffering is here to make us conscious. Okay? The essential function of suffering is to make us conscious. No matter where you are in the awakening journey, the essential function and role of suffering is to make us conscious. I'm repeating this because that's the most fundamental, important thing to understand. Whether you know this or not, meaning whether you see this as true, what I'm saying, will depend on your current level of consciousness and where, therefore, you stand right now in the awakening journey. So let's walk through this stage by stage of the awakening journey. And this pairs very well with my teaching on Awakenpedia called Levels of Consciousness. So I suggest that you read that teaching as well as the teaching on suffering to get a really solid foundational sense of what I'm talking about here. The different stages that I'm referencing in context of suffering via the Levels of Consciousness teaching on Awakenpedia, that's what I'll be referencing in this video chat, all right? So if you are completely unconscious, meaning you are at the lowest level of consciousness, you are just beginning the awakening journey, perhaps it's the first incarnation, right? And I'm speaking in theory, but the point is you're completely unconscious. So much so that you aren't even aware of suffering. You're not even aware that you're suffering. And this is crazy to consider, but most of the world today is at this point of consciousness, this level, this low level of consciousness that they're not even aware that they're suffering. We have 95% of the world population that is banging their head against a wall over and over and over, and they have zero clue that they are even doing it and that it's causing them pain. They're so confused and so ignorant that they actually see that as pleasure and as happiness. So at this level of consciousness, pure unconsciousness, essentially. The role of suffering is to make you aware that you are suffering. It's to make you aware that you have been banging your head against the wall, so that you finally can realize you've been banging your head against the wall and that you're suffering. So the role of suffering at that point is to make you aware that you're suffering, which points to an ascension of consciousness, an ascension of awareness, right? So that you first off become aware that you're even suffering. Now, when you're aware that you're suffering, the role of suffering becomes one of waking you up. At this level of consciousness, right, which I describe in my teaching, in the levels of consciousness teaching, I describe it as contracting unconsciousness. So think about that expression just for a second, contracting unconsciousness. Unconsciousness is getting smaller, which is the same thing as saying that you are growing in consciousness. So the essential function and role of suffering at this level of the journey is to wake you up. Now, in practice, what this is experienced as is paradoxically an intensification of suffering, because you are growing in awareness of the suffering entity that is the ego that is currently in the driver's seat controlling your life. You are becoming more aware of the suffering that you previously were unaware of. So it feels as if the suffering is getting larger and growing more, but it's not. It's simply that you are becoming more aware of it. The awareness is growing of the suffering and the suffering entities, so it's experienced as an intensification of suffering. I know that that can be a confusing thing to grasp, but sit with that. Sit with it, right? Because it's important, and it took me some time to really get there myself. So sit with that. As you grow in awareness, while you're still in the unconscious stage, contracting unconsciousness, it will be experienced as if the suffering is intensifying. Now, as you continue to grow in awareness and you continue to become more conscious, you will usually come into a point on the awakening journey that is often described as the dark night of the soul. This is when suffering peaks in intensity. And of course, as I was just saying, what that means is that the awareness of the suffering is at the peak level, so that it feels as if suffering becomes so intense that it's now no longer tolerable. You can no longer tolerate being the ego and operating from the egoic mind structure. It's too painful. The suffering is too intense. It hurts too much. So much so that, unfortunately, at this point in the journey, oftentimes people decide to take their life. It's where the most suicides occur, because people mistakenly, erroneously believe that the suffering will end by ending their life, their physical life. But what they really are looking for is to end the suffering, which is a death that exists on the level of mind. It is the death of the mind-made self that is the ego, which is what is causing the suffering to exist in the first place. If you realize that, if you can surrender to the suffering at this pivotal inflection point along the journey, it will be revealed to you that the suffering was all going on inside your head. Okay? It was all made up in your mind. It was all an interpretation of the events, as I described in the beginning, of how things should be, not accepting how things are, but imposing a mental position on how things should be according to you. So if you progress through the dark night of the soul successfully, meaning that you lean into it, you don't decide that you want to end your life, that the suffering's too much to bear. Instead, you surrender to it. You'll see the light at the end of the tunnel on the other side. Peace is around the corner, I promise. And so what you find is that the suffering has been going on inside your head this entire time, and that you have been the cause of your suffering, not the world. The world and all external circumstances and conditions are not responsible for the suffering you experience. Suffering, you realize, after progressing through this inflection point, which is when you step out of unconsciousness for the first time into consciousness, you emerge out of your cocoon, caterpillar cocoon, into the baby butterfly for the first time. You realize that it has been you, it has been your mind that's been creating the suffering this entire time, which is so empowering because now you realize that you can control the nature of your experience because it all comes down to how you interpret it. Suffering then becomes a choice. No longer is it something that's happening to you, which is why now, as you continue to ascend in consciousness on this journey, which is now what the third level of consciousness, as I point to in the teaching, which is expanding consciousness. You've progressed through the awakening moment that often corresponds with the dark night of the soul, and now you continue into what often is a very long part of the journey, and it can span months, years, lifetimes, but you're expanding in consciousness now, right? And so the role of suffering at this point, at this stage of the journey, is to remind you of who you really are, to help you fully remember who you are. The awakening moment that you just experienced through the dark night of the soul points to you realizing who you are not. You are not the mind that's causing the suffering. You realize that, and you realize all the other stuff that the mind made you believe that you are. And you realize that there is something deeper underneath it, indwelling, unchanging essence, a formlessness that is stable and grounded and forever, eternally at peace in the now, the here and now. You realize that is who you actually are, not whatever the mind has made you up to believe. And so, as you progress now, continue on in your awakening journey, as you experience life in this human form, you continue to go on, you realize as suffering occurs and you experience life challenges, they become pointers to the remaining ego within you that has yet to be liberated, yet to be dissolved. It, your triggers become your teachers, so that you now know when you experience suffering, at this point, you know that you are the cause of your suffering. So if you're going through life and you experience upsettedness and dissonance and a disruption to your peace, you can now quickly realize, more quickly, I should say, more quickly realize that it is you that is causing this. It's nothing else in the world. It's just your mind, your identification with the mind and through the mind that is causing the suffering. And you realize quickly that it is an error in perception. It's not true. It is just your mind playing make believe and imagining it through an interpretation of how things should be again, as opposed to accepting how things are. It is your mind's influence. And when you realize that, right there, through the noticing, you come back into presence. You come back into consciousness as soon as you recognize that you had been dragged back into unconsciousness. And that's the value of suffering in the expanding consciousness phase of the journey, because you can catch it, and the catching of it is what serves to further dissolve the ego, which is the entity that perpetuates the suffering. So every time now you notice yourself suffering in whatever form and to whatever degree, as any sense of resistance to whatever is happening in the now, it serves to further dissolve the suffering entity that is the ego. And this keeps happening, and it keeps happening, and it keeps happening. It's a rewiring of the mind by that's being driven by this ascension of consciousness, and you keep doing it until you find that you have less triggers, and the time between when you get triggered that causes the suffering, the sense of suffering, to when you can come back into presence, that refraction period shortens, so that what may have first started as maybe you lingered in a mood because of something that happened for many, many months, perhaps years, decades for some people, that time shortens. What goes from decades of being in a mood and staying in the suffering state, forgetting who you are, goes into years, then into months, then into weeks, to days, to hours, to eventually, when you are at such a level of consciousness, such a high level of consciousness, your soul is of such purity, you remember who you are so fully, that in the most extreme state, the theoretically maximized consciousness state of pure consciousness itself, which I point to as level 4 in my teaching, in that state, the role of suffering dissolves, because there no longer is any suffering, because there no longer is any ego, which is the entity, the mind-made entity that creates the suffering. Do you see? I know I threw a lot at you right there, and I spoke pretty fast, so you can slow this down or you can rewatch it. But the last stage of consciousness, the final stage of consciousness, this is the stage of the journey of when you are arriving home, the journey's end. It's when the ego has fully dissolved, so that now you are in a state of no mind, pure being. There's no identification with and through the mind. So no sense of self is derived through the mind, and there's no mental interpretation of what is. And as a result of there being no mental interpretation, the gap between how things should be and how things are collapses, because no longer are you posing a should on the now. No longer is there any way that the now should be other than how it is. So suffering dissolves. There's no resistance to the now. There's no stress. You accept it all. And so your peace is stable, constant, and infinite. There no longer is any suffering, because there no longer is any ego. And this is the interesting part of the journey, where you approach the edge of the mystery. Ram Dass talks often about the edge of the mystery. Eckhart Tolle, various other spiritual teachers all point to the edge of the mystery in some form or another, as when they're approaching such a high level of consciousness, such a pure level of consciousness, where there no longer is any self. And so you are liberated from the form through realization of your essential identity as the formlessness that underlies and indwells within the form, enabling it to be. And this liberation of form, this liberation of the conditioned mind, is the essence of what all religions point to in one way or another as the end of the journey, as the homecoming. In Buddhism, they call it nirvana. In Hinduism, it's called moksha. In Christianity, it's the kingdom of heaven. In simulation theory, it's called escaping the matrix. This is when you are able to rise out of this earthly, physical, sense-perceived dimension into the next phase, the afterlife, as they say. Of course, there is no afterlife, but it's what comes after this earthly experience. Graduating from Earth, the school of Earth, you've completed the curriculum, and suffering is what got you there. Suffering was the vehicle. And that's why suffering is so important, and it's so valuable. That's the value of suffering. It brings you home. Now, this is not to say go out and seek suffering, go out and try to suffer. No, of course not. The aim is peace. But it is to say, if you find yourself suffering, know that it is here to serve you. It is here for your benefit, to make you more conscious, to facilitate your ascension in consciousness out of the ego and into truth, out of the false mind-made self into the true self that is beyond the mind. And suffering, in the way in which it serves to facilitate the growth of your consciousness, is what varies based on where you stand in the awakening journey, which is a function of your karma and how much ego you have to work through, to release. So I hope that was a pretty helpful explanation of suffering, its role in the awakening journey at various points, at the various levels of consciousness, and how it really is so valuable to you, and how it serves to make you more conscious, to facilitate the growth of your consciousness. And I speak from this and about this from firsthand experience directly. I have directly experienced this without any uncertainty or doubt. What I just described to you has been my personal path. And I currently am expanding in consciousness and on my way home. I am heading towards realization of self as pure consciousness. And of course, that final state, that final stage of the awakening journey, the only difference between expanding consciousness and pure consciousness is that there no longer is any forgetfulness. You don't come in and out of the ego anymore. You don't come, you're not dragged back into unconsciousness at various points. At the homecoming, there is only full remembrance of who you really are. And that's the purpose of being here, of existence, of living, is to remember that we're alive, fully alive. That is synonymous with the fully conscious state. such a beautiful journey, and suffering is such a beautiful facilitator and fuel for our transformation. You'll find that it becomes the thing you can be most grateful for. The times in your life that caused the most hardship, tears, agony, pain, suffering, disturbance to your peace. If you lean into this path with earnestness, you will see inevitably that those times were meant to serve you and to provide you with the opportunity to learn lessons. Whether you learned them or not, that's not for me to determine. All right, guys, I'm going to pause here. Thank you for listening to this if you've made it this far. And if you have any questions about this, about suffering, about how suffering pairs with the levels of consciousness, reach out to me. Send me a message personally in the Patreon app, or send me an email, whatever. I'd love to talk with you guys about this. So, all right, thank you.